The first thing you would notice was the music. A thundering dabke drum, a wailing flute, laughter bouncing off crystal chandeliers. The wedding hall in West Beirut looked like every other in the late 1960s. Smoke curling up to the ceiling, gold trim on the walls, children running between tables while waiters balanced trays of lamb and rice. But if you looked closer, the details would start to feel wrong. The photographer changed cameras too often. The band's percussionist never actually played, his hand resting on the body of the drum as if he was listening for a heartbeat. The groom's best man scanned the exits between jokes, counting doorways, not blessings. And the bride's veil never trembled. Under layers of silk and lace, under the borrowed gold and the practiced shyness, her heartbeat was a steady, drilled rhythm. Her real name was Yael Ben Haim, a Mossad officer who spoke Arabic like someone born on the slopes above Nablus. Tonight, on the invitations, she was Rania Khalil, a merchant's daughter from Sidon. Her arm was looped through the man everyone thought was her father. He was not. He was a retired stage actor from Haifa whose job tonight was simple: look proud, look emotional, and die first if anyone started shooting. The guests rose as she appeared in the doorway. Someone whistled. Someone shouted a joke about finally catching the wild groom. Glasses clinked. A small boy fired a cap gun into the air and was hushed by his mother. Only 3 men in the back of the room did not stand. They watched one person only, a compact, well-dressed man seated near the center table, his back to the wall, his eyes always sliding toward the entrance and the kitchen doors. He wore no keffiyeh, no uniform, no insignia. To most of the crowd, he was just an important guest. To the PLO, he was their invisible architect. Fadi al-Khatib, planner of airline hijackings, car bombs in European capitals, commando raids that had turned the second half of the 1960s into a montage of funerals and broken glass. To his family, he was the uncle who paid for schooling and sent money home from foreign cities. To the PLO, he was their professor. To Mossad, he was a simmering war in human form. He had refused every meeting request, changed safe houses like shirts, and never slept twice in the same bed unless there was a woman beside him and a guard behind the door. But he never refused a wedding. The bride stepped forward, the hem of her dress whispering across the carpet. Her bouquet of white roses and orange blossoms seemed to glow under the chandeliers. Only she knew the stems were reinforced, the weight slightly wrong, the plastic tube hidden among flowers, carrying something more dangerous than water. In her ear, the tiniest earpiece carried a voice from a van parked 2 streets away. "Rania, breathe. This is just rehearsal with better clothes," the controller murmured. Her reply was a smile. Brides did not talk to themselves. As she walked, you could almost believe this was real. The groom waiting with nervous eyes, the proud families on both sides. The PLO men relaxed for once, their pistols hidden under jackets but hands far from them, dulled by food and the promise of a long night of dancing. No one in that hall knew that the venue had been rented by a shell company only weeks before, that the groom's cousins at the outer tables were reservists from an Israeli special unit, that nearly a third of the staff were on foreign passports and had rehearsed every move in a warehouse outside Tel Aviv, using chalk lines on the floor instead of marble and a cardboard cutout labeled Fadi. If this failed, it would not just be a botched assassination. It would be an international scandal, a diplomatic earthquake, and perhaps the spark for another regional war. Beirut was full of rivals and observers. Everyone watched everyone. Yael reached the halfway point to the groom, her eyes downcast, her steps slow. On cue, as agreed, Fadi al-Khatib raised his glass in salute to the couple. In the surveillance van, a finger hovered over a switch. Not yet, not at a toast. There was a moment they needed, a precise alignment of people and cameras and sound. But to understand how this hall became a battlefield disguised as a celebration, you have to rewind. Back before the white dress, back before the invitations, Back to the moment when someone in a gray office in Tel Aviv dared to write 2 words on a blank operations file. Fake wedding. Years earlier, long before the fake wedding, long before the hall was rented and the dress measured, Fadi al-Khatib was just a boy kicking a dented football in a refugee camp outside Amman. His father had fled Haifa in 1948 with nothing but a suitcase and a house key that never again opened any door. His mother told him stories of orange groves and sea breezes that he never felt for himself. By his teenage years, Fadi believed 2 things with religious clarity. The world did not care about his people, and no justice would come without force. He studied hard. Numbers calmed him. Patterns soothed him. While others took up rifles, he immersed himself in maps and train timetables, border crossing hours, cargo ship manifests. He discovered that moving money and men quietly could be more dangerous than any single machine gun. By the mid-1960s, to his cousins, he was the clever one who had somehow found work with important people. To the PLO leadership, he was the man who could make 4 men and a suitcase full of explosives appear in a European capital without a single stamp in a single passport. His fingerprints were on operations that governments called terror and supporters called resistance, hijacked airliners on foreign tarmacs, timed explosions at oil refineries, assassinations of diplomats who thought their status made them invulnerable. To the Israelis, he was a creeping disaster. In a quiet office in Tel Aviv, Mossad analysts pinned colored threads across a map. Here, a bombing in West Germany. There, a foiled attempt in Rome. A near miss in Athens. Different operatives, different planners, different cells. But when they traced the financing, the false documents, the travel routes, one name kept appearing in whispers and coded references. Abu Salim, the professor, the ghost from Amman. By 1968, they were almost certain those names belonged to the same man, Fadi al-Khatib. He never walked into a room without knowing his exits. He favored safe houses above cafes, taxis above private cars, and meetings in noisy places where a gunshot might be disguised as a drop tray. He rotated bodyguards, never used the same radio frequency twice, and avoided any pattern that could be charted. Any pattern except one. He loved weddings, family weddings, political weddings, weddings of old comrades' nieces and second cousins. He attended them like pilgrimages, always with a discreet envelope of cash for the new couple. Surrounded by music and confetti, he felt invisible. Security teams could not block off an entire ballroom without causing a scene. Hosts did not frisk honored guests, and in Arab culture, a wedding was sacred ground. Bloodshed there was unthinkable. Unthinkable to everyone except the people tracking him. Inside Mossad, the debate about what to do with Fadi burned for months. The military wanted him dead yesterday. The diplomats warned that killing a high-profile PLO planner in a foreign capital could drag neutral countries into the conflict and destroy fragile back-channel talks. One evening in a smoke-filled briefing room, a senior officer drew a line under the argument. If he lives, airplanes keep exploding and embassies keep burning. If he dies, we may face headlines and protests. Choose your dead. The director circled Fadi's name on the board. The codename Operation Bridal Veil was written in small, neat letters beside it. A sterile phrase wrapped around a lethal intention. From that moment, Mossad accepted a disturbing truth. To reach a man who hid in shadows, they would have to step into a spotlight he trusted. They would have to turn the safest social ritual in his world into a trap. The first breakthrough did not come from a field agent or a dramatic raid. It came from a quiet woman with reading glasses, alone at a desk in a windowless room. Her name was Dalia Sharoni, an analyst in Mossad's research division. For months, she had been buried in intercepted letters, wedding announcements, travel manifests, and telephone logs from friendly intelligence services in Europe and the Middle East. She was not looking for bombs. She was looking for patterns. On her wall, a hand-drawn calendar mapped the late 1960s. Red circles for known PLO meetings, blue for successful operations, black for funerals, green for weddings where suspected PLO figures had appeared. Threads connected cities, Cairo to Prague, Damascus to Algiers, Beirut to Athens. One afternoon, tracing a green thread between Beirut and Amman, she noticed something subtle. Every time a certain extended family held a major event, whispers of Fadi's presence appeared in intercepted chatter. He was never named directly, but referenced in nicknames. In jokes about the professor dancing badly, about the man who loves weddings more than brides. Dahlia marked each instance. The pattern held. He avoided hotels and conferences. He sabotaged attempts to lure him to meetings in safe locations. But weddings? He came when called, especially for families with roots in his old camp outside Amman. They weren't just watching where Fadi went, Dahlia would later say. They were watching how he moved, what he trusted, and when he relaxed. Her report landed on the operations desk like a small bomb. If they could create a wedding tied to the right family, in the right city, with the right invitations, there was a chance, just a chance, that Fadi would walk into it voluntarily, surrounded not by loyal comrades, but by actors, agents, and hidden weapons disguised as decorations. The idea felt insane. It also felt exactly like something he would never expect. Case officers in Beirut began quietly mapping Palestinian and Lebanese families that Fadi favored. One in particular, the Khalils, stood out. A merchant clan with sons in half a dozen cities, respected in refugee camps and drawing rooms alike. They were not PLO, but they were friendly to the cause. Through layers of intermediaries, Mossad identified a weak link, a cousin deep in gambling debt, desperate, angry at the PLO for failing to help him. The approach was careful. No mention of Israel, no mention of intelligence, just businessmen offering to solve his debts in return for a simple favor. Help arrange a grand wedding for a fictitious cousin using the Khalil name to make it respectable. All expenses paid, gifts generous. The only condition, certain guests must be invited, including one of the professor's close proteges. Once that protege accepted, they knew Fadi's curiosity would be piqued. In parallel, Mossad mapped the cities where such a wedding could be held. Amman was too watched. Damascus, too hostile. Cairo, too politically complicated. Beirut, that glittering, dangerous crossroads of the Arab world, was chaotic enough for something like this to disappear in the noise. Agents on European passports rented a hall months in advance, posing as Lebanese expatriates planning to celebrate back home. A bridal dress shop was paid in cash to prepare multiple fittings for a bride whose real identity did not exist. A band yard was quietly approached. Musicians willing to look the other way were selected. Meanwhile, surveillance teams built a composite picture of Fadi's habits at weddings, where he liked to sit, how often he smoked, whether he danced, how close his guards stayed, whether he drank heavily or only sipped. They collected this not from spies in suits, but from gossipy waiters, boastful cousins, and a single bored photographer who loved to accidentally capture important people in the background of his shots. By the time Operation Bridal Veil was approved, the file was thick with details that no newspaper would ever print. The smell of his preferred cologne, the brand of his cigarettes, the way he always brushed crumbs from his lapel after dessert. This was not just about placing a man in a room. It was about understanding when his shoulders dropped, when his inner calculation of threat dipped below a certain level. For Fadi al-Khatib, that moment always came after the bride's entrance. When the room exhaled collectively and joy flooded the hall, that was when they planned to kill him. You do not just fake a wedding in Beirut in the 1960s. Every detail can expose you. The planners of Operation Bridal Veil began with a story. A Khalil cousin returning from years in West Africa, coming home to marry a distant relative from Sidon. Money made abroad, ready to be shown off in a lavish ceremony. That explained the rented hall, the extravagant menu, the foreign-looking guests at the edges. Mossad scriptwriters, yes, they had those constructed full biographies for the bride and groom. Childhood memories, fake schools and cousins, small details for nosy aunties and suspicious uncles. Yael, selected to play the bride, spent weeks memorizing this life. She practiced the accent, the body language of a girl who had grown up between Lebanon and Ghana, the shy tilt of her head when older relatives made teasing remarks. She rehearsed the tiny rituals, how to accept a compliment, how to thank an elder for a gift, exactly how far to lower her eyes without looking unnatural. The groom, an Arabic-speaking officer named Avi, had a simpler role. Foreign returned, flashy, a little arrogant. People would forgive small slips as African influence. His job was to be charming, visible, and always one step away from Fadi's line of sight. The venue was chosen for its labyrinth, a luxurious hall on the ground floor, kitchens and service corridors behind, an underground loading area with 2 exits to different streets. In case of success or disaster, the team needed multiple paths out. Technical officers walked the empty hall with measuring tapes and blueprints. They studied where microphones and speakers could be placed to mask certain sounds. They tested where light fell from chandeliers, ensuring that no single bright flare would wash out the operation in the lenses of any real journalists who might attend. Weapons were a problem. You could not simply walk in with rifles, so they thought sideways. One option involved a toxin delivered in a drink, mimicking a sudden heart attack. But that required certainty he would drink what they offered, and Fadi was cautious. Another involved a shaped charge hidden under a chair, effective but messy and impossible to blame on natural causes. In the end, they settled on a layered approach. First layer, a fast-acting cardiac toxin on the inside of a ring the groom would use to bless Fadi in a traditional gesture, touching his chest briefly in a joking sign of respect. If that failed, or Fadi refused the gesture, a second layer waited. A microcharge embedded in the floral arch behind his chair, triggered from the bouquet the bride would hold as she approached the center of the hall. Third layer. If all subtlety failed, there were 3 concealed pistols in the band's drum, the photographer's bag, and a waiter's tray, each within meters of Fadi. They rehearsed every scenario: the target leaving early, a nervous guard hovering too close, a power outage, a curious child grabbing the bouquet. If anything broke the pattern beyond what they had anticipated, they would abort and eat the cost, leaving behind embarrassed families and a story about a groom who got cold feet. Inside the safe house in the hills above Beirut, the team ran through the ceremony again and again. Yael walked the aisle in a practice dress, pausing at pre-marked spots where microphones would pick up key phrases for the control room. Avi repeated his lines, his jokes, the timing of the ring gesture. Technicians triggered the microcharge on dummies, measuring sound and force under different music volumes. They filmed themselves, then watched the footage like sports teams analyzing opponents. Here, a controller would point, "Your hand lingers too long. That looks unnatural." Here, you look at him too directly. Brides stare at the floor or at the groom. Here, the guard could see the cable if he turns his head. The operations commander, an older man who had seen too many funerals, reminded them of the stakes. If he senses anything strange, he will not pull out a pistol. He will walk away and disappear for another decade. We are not just playing characters. We are building a world where he feels safe for 1 hour. The final piece was the invitation. Through the compromised cousin, word of the grand wedding spread in the right circles. A protege of Fadi's received an ornate card, hand-delivered, with a handwritten note on the back. The protege showed it to his boss. Fadi, amused, asked for details. "A Khalil wedding?" he said, according to an intercepted remark. "They always have good food, and I owe the old man a visit." With that offhand joke, the die was cast. The date was set for a warm evening in late 1969. Operation Bridal Veil moved from paper to reality. Back in the wedding hall, the plan began to breathe. Guests flowed in, a mix of real family, hired extras, and undercover officers. The The smell of roasted lamb and perfume thickened the air. The band played traditional songs, occasionally drifting into popular Egyptian film music of the era. Fadi al-Khatib arrived almost exactly on time, as predicted. 2 bodyguards flanked him, scanning the room with bored efficiency. He wore a dark suit, a simple tie, and carried no visible weapon. He greeted the Khalil elders warmly, kissed cheeks, murmured condolences for an uncle who had died months earlier. If you watched carefully, you would have seen several things happen at once. In the surveillance van, a light blinked green. Target confirmed. On the upper balcony, the photographer adjusted his lens and captured a clear frame of Fadi's face. At the far table, the drummer placed both hands on his instrument, fingers resting near an invisible switch. The ceremony began. Prayers were said. Jokes were made about the groom's lost bachelorhood. Toasts flowed. Fadi's guards relaxed an ounce, conferring briefly about taking turns to smoke outside later. Then came the moment of the bride's entrance, Yael's entrance. As she stepped into the hall, music shifted. The crowd rose. All eyes turned to her, including Fadi's. For a brief second, his hard face softened. Weddings were one of the last places he allowed himself sentimentality. In her ear, the controller's voice was calm. "Rania, you look beautiful. Walk slowly. Remember, when you reach the 3rd column, he will be at your 10 o'clock. She counted columns like stepping stones. 1, 2, 3. Peripheral vision only. Brides did not scan rooms like bodyguards. She saw him, shorter than she had expected, thicker hair. The photograph in her briefing had not captured the intensity of his eyes. In the script, this was the moment the groom was supposed to bring Fadi into a playful exchange. A joke about needing advice from an experienced uncle, an excuse to place his hand briefly against Fadi's chest in a mock blessing and deliver the toxin. Avi played his role, laughing, raising his hand in greeting. "Professor Fadi," he called. "You must bless me. I hear it brings good luck in business and in war." A ripple of laughter. It was natural, in character. Fadi smiled thinly, but something in his gaze sharpened. His guard leaned in, murmuring in his ear. For a heartbeat too long, he hesitated. In the van, someone whispered, "He is not taking the bait." The ringed hand hovered in the air. Avi's smile strained. Fadi patted his own chest instead. "Tonight, I bless you from here, my son," he replied lightly. "Let the bride bring you all the luck you need." First layer. Failed. Inside Yael's palm, the bouquet trigger felt suddenly heavier. The controller's voice tightened, but stayed level. "Proceed to position beta. Do not rush." We moved to second option. The ceremony continued. Chairs scraped. Glasses were filled. The bride and groom took their places at the central table, the floral arch behind them like a halo. As expected, Fadi's seat was 3 chairs away. Just far enough to observe, just close enough to speak to the couple without standing. The microcharge was hidden in that arch, aligned with the back of his chair. All they needed was a moment when music surged loud enough to mask a small blast. 1 note too long, 1 drum beat too much. The band leader, an asset, waited for a subtle hand signal from the drummer, then launched into a louder, faster song. Feet began to stamp. Guests clapped along. The volume climbed. Yael leaned forward to accept congratulations from the woman beside Fadi, angling her bouquet slightly in his direction, as if adjusting her grip. Her thumb found the textured patch on the stem. A child suddenly darted between tables, chasing a balloon. He crashed into Fadi's chair, jolting it. One of the bodyguards snapped, pulling the boy back roughly. Fadi turned, frowning, attention momentarily away from the bride. "Abort! Abort!" the controller hissed. "Not with the child so close." Yael froze, smile fixed, thumb easing away from the trigger. For a few terrible seconds, the op teetered over chaos. First plan gone, second plan compromised by a child's game. Third, plan the guns would mean open violence, screaming, bodies on the floor, and an international crisis impossible to bury. But then the room gave them a gift. As the music pounded, waiters began serving coffee, thick, dark, in tiny cups. A tray approached Fadi's table. One of his guards waved it away, then paused to argue about the quality of the coffee, clearly wanting some himself. Fadi, amused, reached for a cup. The waiter, an Israeli officer under deep cover, adjusted his tray so that the cup with the faintest oily sheen on top, the one dosed with a fast-acting compound designed to mimic a catastrophic coronary slid naturally into Fadi's hand. Up to this point, the target had avoided every planned touch. He had broken their choreography. Now, by his own choice, he stepped into a different one. He raised the cup, inhaled the aroma, and took a sip. In the surveillance van, no one spoke. Seconds stretched. The music swelled. Yael's smile did not change, but her knuckles whitened around the bouquet. Then it happened so quietly you might have missed it. Fadi's fingers tightened around the tiny cup. His eyes blinked twice, slower than normal. A shadow passed across his features. He shifted in his chair, as if a sudden cramp had seized his chest. One of his guards leaned in. "Are you well, sir?" Fadi opened his mouth to answer. No sound came. The cup slipped from his hand, spilling coffee across the white tablecloth. To half the guests, it looked like a fainting spell. To the other half, like a man overcome by emotion. To the people who had built this wedding out of lies, it looked like the end of a war. The official story wrote itself within hours. The morning after the wedding, Beirut newspapers carried a small but dramatic headline: "Prominent Palestinian figure dies of heart attack at celebration." The article mentioned his contributions to the cause, his history of exile, the tragedy of a life cut short at a moment of joy. Doctors at the local hospital, after a cursory examination and under heavy pressure from armed men in the corridors, signed off on a natural cause of death. Middle-aged man, high stress, heavy smoker. It fit. No autopsy was requested. No one wanted to cut open a hero. In the chaos immediately after Fadi collapsed, the hall had erupted in shouts. Chairs scraped back. Women cried out. Someone screamed for an ambulance. Someone else shouted for the doors to be closed, fearing an attack. In that confusion, the Mossad team executed the least glamorous part of the operation, leaving. The bride fainted convincingly, carried out by female relatives, some real, some not, into a waiting car that disappeared into the Beirut night, and then, hours later, into the anonymity of the sea on a small boat. The groom stayed just long enough to ride with Fadi's body to the hospital in a show of respect, then slipped away in the corridor, replaced by a decoy relative for anyone asking questions later. The band packed up, grumbling about the ruined evening. The photographer handed over his film to a Khalil elder as a gesture of goodwill, never revealing that the real negatives had already been swapped in the darkroom for blank stock. By the time anyone thought to count how many guests had truly belonged to either family, most of Mossad's people were already on their way to safe houses, embassy cars, or fishing villages with discreet contacts and fast boats. On paper, it was a heart attack. But anyone fluent in the language of covert warfare recognized the signature. Whispers spread in PLO circles. Some were convinced the Mossad had finally killed their professor. Others argued it had to be internal betrayal, poison from a rival faction. The idea that an entire wedding could have been engineered just to eliminate one man was almost too audacious to accept. In the host government, confusion hardened into anger. Ministers demanded to know how a foreign service could operate such an elaborate plot under their noses. Security chiefs denied responsibility, then quietly demanded explanations from their own subordinates. Publicly, officials blamed Zionist agents and vowed to strengthen internal security. Privately, some grudgingly admired the precision. Hostile states condemned the alleged Israeli role. Allied intelligence services took notes. In Tel Aviv, there were no public celebrations. In a quiet room, the operations commander went through the after-action report, line by line. They had removed a tactician who had cost them dozens of lives and threatened hundreds more. They had done it without a car bomb on a crowded street or a shootout in a hotel lobby. No airplanes were hijacked in the months that followed, bearing his signature. It was, by the cold arithmetic of statecraft, a success. But even in success, there was blowback. Without Fadi's calculating influence, some PLO cells drifted toward more reckless, spectacular violence. The absence of a strategist sometimes leaves space for zealots. Networks fractured, reformed, mutated. For every mastermind removed, another angry young man somewhere took notes. The fake wedding became a quiet legend in certain circles. Not confirmed, never admitted, but told in low voices among people who lived in the shadows. It proved one thing above all: that in the world of covert power, nothing is too sacred to weaponize. Not airports, not hotels, not even the moment when two families gather to celebrate love. For the Khalil family, the memory of that night would always be complicated. They had gained money, paid off debts, and lost a certain innocence about what could be turned into a tool. Some never learned the full truth. Others preferred not to know. Decades later, if you asked Yael about the operation, she would not talk about the toxin, the rehearsals, or the moment the cup slipped from his hand. She would talk about the sound of the music under the chandeliers, the way children laughed, even as history shifted around them. It revealed a world, she might say, where some deaths are paperwork, not headlines. So what do you think? Does eliminating one man like Fadi al-Khatib make the world safer? Or does it simply move violence into a different shape, in a different city, at a different wedding someday? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this changed how you see covert warfare, like, share, and subscribe. We are breaking down the operations governments deny and the machinery of power that runs in permanent shadow.